Oh, okay. It says it's live. I'm going to trust it. Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. So today what we're going to begin, and I say begin because this is going to take at least 2 parts, is covering where the modern state of Israel came from. It's especially appropriate at this time of year because after the Maccabee revolt was the rebirth of an independent Jewish state that would eventually collapse when the Romans invaded and was then no longer independent until 1948. So Maccabees and the modern world is very, very close because in between we did not have our own state. We were still a nation, we were still a people, but we were a stateless people. We were not in control of any particular piece of territory. So we're not going to talk tonight about the ancient history. We want to talk about the modern history, about how the state became a state again. Now, as you would have seen in the brochure, you know, the class is advertised as Pathway to Judaism. And for some people, there's a little confusion of why are we learning about Israel to be Jewish? And we might be able to accept that, yes, the ancient country of Israel, that was very important for Jewish history, and there were certain commandments connected to the land. Israel, you know, it's a country, right? Yes, and it is also the homeland of our people. It is also the emotional root of much of Jewish practice and Jewish thought. And it also contains, outside of the it also contains the single largest population of other Jewish people. And as Jewish people, we care about other Jewish people. And as we're going to see, that is one of the reasons why the modern state of Israel was born, was because we cared about each other. And we're going to get rolling. We're only going to, I hope, make it up to 1948 tonight. Next week, we're going to go from 1948 maybe to the modern world. We'll see. But I just want to do from the early days of what's known as Zionism until 1948. Primarily, I want to give this as a nice heavy focus because a lot of people think that the modern state of Israel began when it declared independence in 1948. And the roots of the modern state of Israel were laid down much earlier than that. But before we do that, we have to understand that even that early movement of Jews back to the land of Israel, as it was then called Palestine, it was one of the territories of the Ottoman Empire. They were not the first Jews in the land of Israel. It wasn't as though all the Jews left 2,000 years ago, and then Jews started coming back. There has always been a constant presence of Jews in the state of Israel, in the territory of Israel. Right? There has never been a period in history since we came back from Egypt where the land did not have some Jews. Even during the Babylonian captivity, some Jews were left behind. And certainly over the last 2,000 years, many, many Jews still lived in the land of Israel. They were not in control. They didn't have the government. They weren't the king. They didn't get to make the laws around them, but they lived there. And it goes back to what we see from Psalm 137, right? We know, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. So we keep Israel in our mind, even when we're apart, but we also don't let go if we're there. So when we returned from the Babylonian exile and we resisted Roman occupation and we held on throughout persecution, these things most people remember. But what happened then? What happened to us during that Roman period? Where did people go? Well, there were famines and there were droughts and there was religious and ethnic persecution under the Byzantine, the Muslim, the Crusader, the Muslim again, and the Ottoman empires. And yet there were always Jews who remained in the land of Israel. A very small population, depending upon which era, but there were always Jews who remained. So why then did we leave in large numbers, right? If a small group remained, but the majority of the Jews lived outside of Israel, why did that happen? Well, first of all, for most of the last 2,000 years, since the Roman occupation and their policies, Israel has not been an easy place to live. It's There has been excessive taxation. That is to say, Jews were often singled out as having to pay additional taxes, or we had limits on what we could own and what kind of jobs we could do. Persecuted when we tried to live Jewishly. Our buildings could only be built of a certain height. Our communities could only have certain public observances. We were not allowed to live an easy and open Jewish life. Many Jews were taken as slaves during this time period. The overall security and safety of the region during much of this time was not very good. So you had your regular bandits and robbers that didn't make life terribly nice. And the communities that were abroad, originally the Babylonian communities, but also in Egypt, throughout Asia Minor, meaning Turkey, and then on into Europe and North Africa. By comparison, they did really well. They were thriving and they were safe and things were not looking bad. The thing to remember then is that we did not leave in large numbers. That is to say, there was no mass exodus from Israel. It wasn't as though everyone packed up the Torah and started walking. That isn't what happened. Yes, slaves were taken, and many of them were simply lost as they were taken. But we, as the Jewish people, we never voluntarily left as a group from the land of Israel. Individual families made choices. We can stay and starve, or we can go live with our brother in Pumbedita, in what's now modern-day Iraq, or we can go to Egypt, or we can go to Turkey. And hope to go, but I'm tired of burying my babies, and I'd like to live somewhere where my children could grow up. So we'll go and live with my cousins who have just moved to Greece or who have just moved to Morocco. And so individually people would leave. But even that doesn't account for the difference in numbers. The real difference was that the suffering communities in the land of Israel suffered. They were not able to continue their population growth. If you live in a nice, happy community, then you have 4 kids and your 4 kids have 4 kids, and now you've got 16 kids and they have 4 kids and my math stops there. You keep getting more and more and more. Your population is always having trouble, then you're lucky if you can keep the same number. So it wasn't just that the Jews left, it was the Jews stayed, and we got smaller and smaller because of the pressures and because of the problems. And the Jews who lived outside got bigger and bigger because generally during much of this history, it was better to be outside of the land of Israel than in. And that, I should point out, goes for most of the people as well who lived in the land of Israel, even if they weren't Jewish. Once you get past the persecution, the banditry affected everyone, and the constant warfare affected everyone, and the famines and droughts affected everyone, and there were no good policies for managing the land. And so it wasn't a terribly popular place to live for anyone, which is why going throughout all of the Middle Eastern history, you don't hear about the land of Israel being an important place during those years, because for most of the rest of the countries and communities it wasn't. But we held on. Okay, so were we supposed to return? This was a very big debate in the 1800s, which is when our story really begins, because there were many, many Jews who believed that we were not supposed to go back to the land of Israel. Period. They said, unless the Lord build the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman keeps vigil in vain. So from Psalms 127, they took this verse to mean that we could only return as a nation to the land of Israel when Mashiach came, when the Messiah came. Then we should just stay where we were. And that was I would argue, a majority position among the Orthodox Jews of the 1880s and the 1800s, was that we should simply stay and wait for the Messiah. You'll see a quote here from the modern Satmar Rebbe, who has passed away, Yoel Teitelbaum, as he says it, even if the members of the Knesset, that's the government in Israel, were righteous and holy, by the way, he thought they were not, it is a terrible and awful crime, a criminal iniquity to seize redemption and rule before the time has come. People who went to rebuild the land of Israel and make it a Jewish homeland again because they were jumping the gun. They were trying to get ahead of God's plan And he considered that to be a sin, as did many other Hasidic and Orthodox leaders in the 1800s, and some even to this day, that don't believe that Israel should have been built. The opinion has become less popular since then, but there are still some who hold to that. But back in the early 1880s, many people believe that. And one of the reasons they believe that, I didn't put the citation there. Sorry, this is from the Talmud in Ketubot 111. Is because there is a teaching in the Talmud, and that may be a little small. People read that, I don't know. Let me paraphrase it a bit. Basically, it's an argument back and forth about whether you're allowed to move from Babylon back to the land of Israel. And this was done during a time when there were communities in Israel and communities in Babylon. And some people said you were not allowed to go back to Israel. And others said, of course you can go back to Israel. Israel is the best place to be, spiritually, not for your life, of course, but spiritually it was very good. And the debate ranged over this idea that God had made us take an oath. Verses in Song of Songs, where God made us take an oath that we would not go back to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, like a wall. And that was believed to be meant during much of the Middle Ages and later, that we should not go back to Israel as a group. If your family wants to move or your family wants to move, that's fine. A movement. We shouldn't be organized. We shouldn't all rally together and go back. That's how this verse was interpreted. You'll see that the verse also was interpreted that we should not rebel against the other nations, meaning if we live in another country, we should be good citizens of that country. And the third oath was that the other nations should not treat us too badly. And really that third oath is kind of the lead-in of why people began to look at this differently in the 1880s, which is in the 1880s, especially in Europe, the other nations were not treating us so well. They were going well beyond what they had done in the past. And for many Jews, the bet was off, right? Where the deal is off. We will stay and be loyal citizens if you treat us decently, but if you treat us like this, we need another plan. So that comes to, why do we come back in large numbers? Well, first of all, because, again, from the Talmud, it says a man can compel his entire household to go up with him to the land of Israel, but may not compel them to leave. Decided that I wanted to move to the land of Israel. I am allowed, according to Jewish law, to drag my family there, whether they like it or not. But if I wanted to leave the land of Israel, I'm not allowed to drag my family with me. If they say, no, we want to stay, I have to respect that choice. And that's showing that going to Israel and living in Israel does have a special status in Jewish law. Whether we're going as a wall or not, well, at this point in the 1880s, a lot like a wall. We were starting to really work together. And that was mainly due to two reasons. One, there was in the 1880s a rise in the idea of self-determination. So this was an idea that the United States was one of the early champions of. That when we founded our country, we believed in this thing called democracy. Were the ultimate source of authority, that they were the ones who should be in charge of their destiny, not a king, not some small group of dukes and earls, but that the people should be in charge. And throughout the 1800s, as the empires of Europe began to shake, more and more people were saying, why should Austria-Hungary be in charge of this whole mix of people, of Czechs and Slovaks and Magyars and all these other different types of people? Really, shouldn't the Czechs be in charge of their own life? Shouldn't the Romanians be in charge of their own life? And this was a very important movement that was saying not only should there be democracy and self-determination and within a country, but that groups of people had a right to be in charge of themselves and not be pushed around by other groups of people. And Jewish thinkers said, yes, us too, right? We have been living among you, scattered throughout the world. Shouldn't we also have the right to have a place where we can be in charge of our own life and we're not being pushed around by your governments? and your other people. And that really is part two, which is the anti-Semitism in Europe was becoming especially terrible in the 1800s, and especially in the 1880s. There were pogroms, which were government approved attacks on Jewish villages and towns and homes, would literally come in with their soldiers and butcher and vandalize the area in order to teach us a lesson, to keep us in our place. And this same attack was one of the reasons why many Jews began moving to the United States in the 1880s. And that was the sort of the first big wave of US immigration of Jewish people. So one of the things that really made people start thinking seriously, even in the US, remember back in the 1880s, this was not exactly in the modern US, but even in the US, are we secure? Will we always be treated right? Or are we just guests of their country? Or will they treat us better if they know that there is a country that backs us up? If there is a Jewish country, so we can be more normalized like everyone else. And shouldn't we at least have a country, a spot, just one little place on earth that Jews can say, this is the place that Jews can go no matter what? And that point's going to come back very, very strongly in just a few slides. So we talk often about the first Aliyah, and that means the first wave of immigration to the land of Israel. And that roughly goes from 1882 to 1903. And during this period, you can see it's just getting going. About 35,000 Jews moved to the land of Israel. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not a lot, but it's a lot compared to how many were there. And they're mainly from Russia and Romania, where the persecutions were especially bad at that time. And they began to buy up land from mainly from the Ottoman landowners. Remember, the land of Israel at this time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. That's the Empire of Turkey, control this whole area. And most of the land belonged to people in Turkey, not to people who lived in what was called Palestine. So if you wanted to buy land, you had to go talk to somebody in Constantinople, right, or Istanbul. So Jews began to buy land. So some of you may remember or have seen pictures of the little blue boxes, English, that people would put money in and donate and send to help purchase land and revitalize the land. And this gave people places to build their farms and to begin to have a Jewish life in the land of Israel that was more than it had been for the last couple thousand years. Of course, this made changes that local people who were already living in the land and who were not Jewish weren't always so happy with. One of the biggest problems was that the owners of the land lived in Turkey, but the workers of the land lived in the land. And when the Jews bought the land, they didn't buy it as an investment for the workers to keep working on it. They bought the land so that Jews could come and live and work on it. You've been working on this piece of land, or your family's been working on this piece of land, and you've been paying your rent to the guy off in Turkey for 100 years. And some guy shows up with a piece of paper who says, I own the land now, and I'm going to be a farmer too. You're not going to cheer him for his agricultural initiative. You're going to say, but what am I supposed to do? Right? This has been the land that I've lived on. I didn't own it, but I used it and I rented it, and this has been my family's land for so long. And that was the beginning of the friction between the Jews and the residents who were already there. The other issue that was happening, which is only going to get worse after Britain gets involved, is we saw ourselves as coming back to our home, of coming back to our homeland. The people who lived there did not see brothers and sisters coming home. They saw Europeans. And what is it when Europeans move into what we now call a third world country and try to set up businesses and take over and move their population around? What do we call that? What's that? Invasion. Okay, but we have a softer word for that. Colonization. Right? Colonization. I mean, that's what the United States was. right? Population from England moved to New England. They even called it that. And they began to take over, and they built their cities and built their towns, and they started pushing out the other people. People from England, they did a lot of this, but other countries did too. The Netherlands also did some, and the Portuguese and the Spanish, of course, throughout all of Latin America, moved into Southeast Asia. There were wars fought in China. All of Africa was being colonized and taken over. We can still look at South Africa as one of the examples of the leftover parts of that. India still was under British rule and wouldn't get its independence until the 1940s. So, yeah. If you were a local and you saw these people coming, you didn't think of them as being your brothers and sisters. You said they're Europeans and they're colonialists. They are coming to take over. They are coming to colonize, not they are coming home. And that difference in perspective is one of the problems that is still ongoing between the view of the Palestinians and our view of our place in the land. And it's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to make peace, because they refuse to accept that we are coming home. They only see us as being invaders, as being colonists. And that is a real difficult gap to try and bridge, to get them to see, no, we just wanted to come home. That's all we were doing. We were not, trust me, we were not coming here as Europeans. If the Europeans thought of us as Europeans, we wouldn't have left Europe. Right? If Europe had been good to us, we probably wouldn't have come here, at least not the same number of people. It's because Europe has been so mean that we're leaving. So we're not representing Europe, we're escaping Europe. But those conversations didn't really happen. Okay, so first Aliyah. And this is right around the same time that we are formally getting a name for this movement, and it's called Zionism. So Zionism comes from the word Zion. Zion means Zion, which is a word that can mean both Jerusalem or also the whole group of people that we would call the people of Israel. Zionism was the name for this movement of the Jews should have a place. And the first Zionist Congress in 1897, which was chaired by Theodor Herzl, should learn his name well, it came to a number of points, of principles, of ideas, of goals that they wanted to have. So one, the promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. That was one of their goals. We want to be able to help Jews settle in Palestine. Now you should realize that we keep using the term Palestine, but there was no country of Palestine at this time. It was a territory that was being controlled. Think of it like if you said Antarctica. Right? If I say that somebody is visiting Antarctica, well, Antarctica isn't a country. It's a region. It's a place. And at the time, Palestine was a region of the Ottoman Empire. And the name was still there because that was the name the Romans had given it in order to insult us, because it was the Roman word for the Philistines, which were the enemies that we had had long before the Romans. So the Romans put this insulting name on the land after they kicked us out. And that was the name that it was still called by the people who controlled it. But it never was its own independent country, which is going to become really important in a little bit. So we're using the term Palestine here as a region term. Part two, the federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of the various countries. They wanted to get the Jews working together. So there might be Jews in Germany and France and Russia and Austria and all these other places. They wanted to organize them into groups together for these goals. They didn't want people to just have to try and do this all on their own. They needed groups to work together. Three, the strengthening of Jewish feeling and consciousness. Of course, we were Jewish in a religious sense, and we were Jewish in the sense that we lived in our village together, or maybe a city together. But they really wanted to make Jews think more about being Jewish as a global feeling, as something that was all of us connected, all of us together, no matter where we live. And that was something that was very important to get moving again. I mean, we knew it, but we didn't always think about it. And the Zionist Congress wanted to get that up. And then part four, preparatory steps for the attainment of those government grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose, which is really, really fancied old talk. We're basically saying, trying to get other governments to work with us, right? Because they knew that they couldn't just walk into the land of Palestine, start plowing the field and saying, we're a country now. They had to get the approval and support of other countries before their country could become independent. And so they began to work to talk and to lobby and try to convince the leaders of other countries around the world to become independent. Good? Good. And also, they adopted Hatikva, the national anthem.
Oh, entonces I had a question.
Yes.
Si el Mesías libertará a Israel del sionismo.
The Messiah going to liberate Yisrael
Del sionismo.
from the Zionist government.
No.
No.
That's the short answer, right? So the first thing to think about is that we don't know exactly what the mechanics of the Messiah, the Mashiach, look like. The second thing to realize is that the current government that Israel has is a government that is representing the will of the people. It's a democracy. It is not it's not a dictatorship. It's not a false king. It is the same as we have used for thousands of years, where the people in your village, in your town, in your synagogue would meet and talk and vote to decide what the village, the town, the synagogue should do. We have had that kind of soft democracy for a very, very long time. And no one ever thought that was a bad way for Jewish people to live. So the people who talk as though the Zionist government is wrong are usually people who don't want Jews in Israel at all. They want everyone to just go home, meaning outside of Israel, and wait for the Messiah. And that's not anywhere in Jewish thinking something that we have to do. Yes, there were people who recommended against it, mainly because moving back to Israel in a group would have been a big problem, and there was no opportunity. But at this time, there was an opportunity, and we can see that it was successful by the fact that it worked. Because of the miracle of 1948, we have to recognize that that could not have happened without God's help. And that gives us great encouragement that what's happening in Israel is something that can be a part of the redemption of our people. It's not the opposite of redemption. Now, when the Messiah comes, will things change? Maybe. I don't know. I hope I get to see. But I don't think that the current government is a problem. I think people can argue about who should be in charge of the government and all of that. That's politics. But democracy is absolutely a good system for the Jews to use until we find something better. And if the Messiah comes and gives us something better, we'll listen. And if the Messiah comes and says, democracy is great, guys, keep going, we'll keep going.
The Messiah? Is it necessary?
Of course.
Really? Why? It's good.
The good is not great.
Okay.
So is the Messiah necessary? We'll go into this a lot more detail another time. But when Israel is still fighting, and Israel is still having to have an army like it does, and has to worry about the life of all of its people, the Messiah could really help a lot with that. Right? We're not there yet. We're not at the perfect stage yet. So we're better than where we were, right? Because as we're going to see, the people who aren't able to go to Israel, the people who are stuck in Europe, they're going to face disaster that if they could have gone to Israel, millions of people could have been saved. So we are better now because we have Israel than we were, but we're not done. And redemption has not finished. We might be at the beginning, what we call the threshold. It's like we can sort of see it maybe in the distance, but we're not there yet. And to get all the way to the final stage, yes, we need Mashiach.
I had the other question, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Zionism is not Judaism.
Correct.
It's different.
Of course. Right.
It's Judaism, not Zionism.
Right. So Zionism is a political idea that the Jews should have a state, that we should have a country. That is not opposite of Judaism, right? They're parallel ideas.
Okay.
right? So there's Judaism, which is how do we live our life each day? What do I do each day? How do I treat people right? What do I do with my life? And then there's Zionism, which says, while you're doing this, it would be good if we had our own country. That's what Zionism adds, is a political idea that being Jewish with a country is easier, safer, and better than being Jewish without a country. So they're not opposite. They're parallel. All right, we can talk more later when we talk about the Messiah and the end of days, but I've got a timeline here. Second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration, is usually measured from 1904 to 1914, the beginning of World War I. About 40,000 people come, again, mostly from Russia. And you'll find that the people who are coming at this point are mostly what we would call today radicals. These are people with political ideas like socialism, some of them even communism, that start what we call the kibbutz movement, which were collectively owned farms where everybody owned the farm. And it wasn't my tractor, it wasn't your house, it was our tractor, our house, and everyone just used it together. And these early pioneers, the chalutzim, they believed very strongly in the strength of the community and of working together. This was also the same time when Tel Aviv was founded. And this is also when Hebrew was restarted as a regular conversation language. Prior to this, of course, Jews knew Hebrew because of prayer and they knew Hebrew because of study, but people didn't usually in their regular life speak Hebrew when they were just talking to each other in the house or in the supermarket. There were no supermarkets, but you know what I mean. And at this point was when people began to switch to using Hebrew as the language of the people who lived in Israel. A major start. Good, good. Okay, World War I comes along. This makes a lot of difference to the story, because remember how I talked about in the first Zionist Congress, for help from other countries to be independent, was never going to let Israel become independent. But during World War I, the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side. They were with the Germans. And so when the Ottoman Empire lost, the French and the British took that territory. They literally sat down, what's called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. They sat down with markers, with a big map, and they said, okay, you get this, and we get this, and you get that. And the British and the French divided up the Ottoman Empire for themselves, and they left them Turkey. Now, remember I said before that a lot of people thought that us coming from Europe, we looked like colonists? This made it worse. Because now you have the British and the French grabbing pieces of the Middle East. And now we kind of look like we're part of this process. And we were helped and also hurt when in 1917, the British government makes a declaration. They make a very public statement called the Balfour Declaration. The government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So what they were trying to say is the British government thought it was a good idea for there to be a Jewish home in Palestine, in that territory. They also thought that it was a good idea if the other people who lived there kept their rights and freedoms. A good idea that Jews who didn't live in Israel should still be treated properly, because they didn't want this to be an excuse of, oh, there's a country for you Jews, get out. They didn't want people to do that. They say, look, if Jews want to live here, that's okay. If they want to live there, that's okay. And we'll support the idea. Now, this was a very important first step towards having the idea that the person in charge, the British government, would allow, maybe at some point, us to have our own country in that territory. Good? Good. Okay. At the time, the British were in charge of what's called the Mandate for Palestine, and the borders of the territory were all here. Now, if you know what the map looks like today, everything from the Jordan River over is called Jordan. And that was an agreement that the British made later in the 1920s with the Hashemite kingdom to create a new country and give it to their ally. So that's how what was this one giant piece got divided into two pieces. Now you'll note when the Balfour Declaration was made, it was talking about everything here and changed the borders. So that kind of bothered us a little. As you can see, we were sort of hoping that we might get this territory to be a Jewish state, but that's not going to happen anymore because now we've got a big slice taken out. And as we're going to see in the end, other slices get taken as well. Okay, so third Aliyah, after the war, 1919 to 1923. The British are in charge now. And this is going to change a lot of things as we're going to see going forward. So one thing that happens is you get another wave of immigrants, about 40,000 people, and a lot more work is being done to repair the country, improve the country. So the areas that are up here are all like swampy and wet, and the river systems have been clogged, and so the land is flooded because of the unnatural ways that people were using the land. We got rid of it, and we got rid of the malaria and the diseases and all the other problems that were happening there. Starts taking off during this time period. I should point out, if you're interested to know what was Israel like before we came back, Twain. You all know Mark Twain? He took a tour all around the world about his experiences in the Holy Land, as he called it, in the land of Palestine and Israel. And he called it the worst place on earth, that it was the most depressing, sickest, weakest, barren, dead place he'd ever seen on earth. And he traveled the entire globe, because no one was really trying to care for it. We began to change that. And that was what was happening. At this time as well is when the Haganah was being formed. That was like a militia. The Jews were being attacked by other people, so they began to get rifles, they began to train to protect their farms and settlements and towns. Good so far? Okay, I know we're moving fast. So as I mentioned, they divided in 1922, and now you have Transjordan, and now you have what they're calling Palestine. And we'll leave it there because I already talked about that. And get to 1924 to 29. This is the fourth Aliyah. 82,000 immigrants. Notice the numbers are going up of people that are coming. And more small towns are being done and light industries being done. So it's not just farmers and people living only in Tel Aviv. It's people are spreading out, and they are really beginning to make towns, villages, and a life. Just idealists, who are all singing and wearing berets, but it's regular people who are working all over to form a new life here. Okay, then we move into the fifth Aliyah. Big jump, right? So 1929 to 39, about 250,000 new immigrants. Most of these are arriving on the eve of World War II. Because remember, World War II started in 1939, but Hitler's persecution of the Jews began 6 years earlier than that, which meant that the Jews, after he came to power, began saying, we need to leave. This is not a good place for us to live anymore. Now, you might ask, well, why didn't we just all go to the United States? Right? Anyone know why we didn't go to the U.S. at this time?
They wouldn't let us in.
They wouldn't let us in, right? Following World War I, the U.S. closed its immigration. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second, but just in case you were wondering. So by 1940, when the war is really getting going, there are now about 450,000 Jews living in the land of Israel. The population has really risen very quickly, which causes problems, right? So there was resistance to us living in the land of Israel. As our population continues to grow, especially under the British period, the Arabs who live there begin to organize attacks and resistance against us. So there was a huge riot, Roque? I misspelled rock. There were huge riots in Hebron in 1929 that also inflamed and hurt other people around the country. And between 1936 and 1939, there was the Great Revolt, as it's often called, the uprising of Arabs, which were demanding full independence from the British control. You'll notice that their timing, they were anticipating that they could break away from England because England was too worried about the war that was coming with Germany. It didn't work out like that. England stopped the revolt and put it down, but the British did agree to limit Jewish immigration. So we were now being told, you're not allowed to move to Israel. So think about that for the moment. The US, as I mentioned, has already closed its borders. And now Israel, under the British, are closing the borders of Israel because of the fighting that's happening because of the resistance of the local Arabs. So the two countries that had the best chance of having Jews move into them are now being locked just as World War II is starting. It's really bad timing. Okay, so what happens after this? Did I get my slides a little bit weird? No, this is 1937. No, that's right. This is the Peel Plan. Right, okay. So in 1937, seeing that there's all these problems, the British begin to try to work out, what are we going to do about this? Because they don't really want to stay in charge of this place forever. Because it's not worth much to anyone, and it's just a real pain. So one of the first ideas they come up with is what's called the Peel Partition. And the idea was they would give this section to the Jews, and they would give this section as a special Jerusalem zone, and then there would be this section and what we call the West Bank as part of the Arab zone. So that was the original idea that the British were thinking about. But they never put that into place. They eventually say, you know what, we're not going to keep control of Jerusalem, which is what they had been planning. We're going to have to change all of this. But right now there's a war happening, so we'll get back to this, which is what happens. So between the storms, between World War I, between World War II, the end of World War II, what's going on? The British are worried about the strife. They have limited and stopped the Jewish immigration. The US and other nations also have anti-immigration laws that were explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, right? This wasn't just, we don't want foreigners. It was, we don't want non-white foreigners. I mean, that was actually what it said. Yeah, the US was not afraid to say that they were racist back then. They were very open about it. And so people who were not white were not being allowed in any size of population. So the Jews were trapped in Europe. Now that meant that Jews were going to be available for the Holocaust. If the US and Britain had had different policies, millions of lives could have been saved. But unfortunately, even though they were not like the Nazis, they were not trying to kill the Jews, they also were not interested in saving the Jews if it made problems for themselves. And by problems in the US, I just mean they didn't like us. It wasn't like we were going to upset the US. In Palestine, at least there were some armed conflicts that the British might be worried about. Problem. Now, the Jews did fight back in the land of Israel against the British and against their attackers. Sometimes passively, they would smuggle people in, they would smuggle weapons in order to defend themselves and work on this. And some acts of Jews did commit acts of terror. There were Jews on the extreme end who did attack the British and who did attack Arabs in ways that we would call terrorism. It was not the majority. It was not the policy. It certainly wasn't what most Jews wanted. But we do have to admit there was a very small number who did do very terrible things. Thankfully, it was the tiniest of minorities. All right, so World War II comes. Just checking my clock. The Holocaust obviously reminds us of why we wanted a homeland. right? We wanted a homeland so that something like the Holocaust couldn't have happened. If all the Jews who were about to be killed in the Holocaust could have gotten on a boat and left, then 6 million people would not have had to have been killed. Also, at the same time, anti-Semitism and communism in Eastern Europe, as the Iron Curtain starts coming down right after World War II, is also making more Jews want to leave. And Israel became the destination of choice, where they wanted to go after the war. Some wanted to go to Western Europe, some wanted to go to the US, but Israel was very much in the mind of many Jews right after the war. Unfortunately, Britain still did not want to let Jewish refugees in after the war. Eventually, they are pressured, mostly by the US, to allow more, and about 100,000 immigrants are allowed in right after the war. Hundreds of thousands of Jews who wanted to come in right after the war that were not allowed to. Now, one of the reasons why they were not allowed to, apart from upsetting the local Arabs and causing more conflict, was that everybody realized that the British were going to leave, and that when it left, some kind of partition, some sort of division was going to be needed, and the partition was going to be based on the population. So the more Jews you let in now, the more land they're going to get. So by keeping the Jews out, even though they were wanting to go in, you are able to keep the final partition weaker for the Jewish side. So the UN does eventually vote to partition, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, what the partition looks like. In 1947, you're looking for the folders? Yes. In 1947, we'll be done at 7. In 1947, the UN votes 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions, and 1 person who didn't show up to vote. That was Thailand. And they vote in favor of the partition. We just celebrated the 150th anniversary, if my math is right, of this back in November, 1947 to 2017. Yeah, 150 years. 150 years. What's that?
50 years.
50 years? No, more than
More
that.
than
70
that.
years.
70 years.
70 years. 70 years. This is why I'm not an accountant. All right, 70th anniversary. A UN resolution 181 was done on November 29th, my brother's birthday, 70 years ago, and we accepted the partition. We're going to show you the map, and I'll show you the map in just a second. The Arabs who were in Palestine did not accept the partition, and the Arabs in the surrounding countries did not accept the partition. So let's see if we can figure out why. So this is what the partition was going to be. This is what the United Nations said would happen and what we agreed to. So there would be a Jewish state here and here and here. Now this area here is called the Negev. That's the desert of Israel. So like nobody lives there. Right? Beersheba at the time was like the farthest south that there was any reasonable size settlement. So this is basically empty land. So we were given this area, and that area. The Arabs were going to be given this area, and this area. And Jerusalem was going to be an international city controlled by the United Nations and by its own citizens as a democracy. So that was the plan that the UN had. Now, was this a plan we wanted? Did we think this was perfect? Did we think this was even necessarily fair? No, not so much. But it was a state, which was our plan. And so the Jews were willing to accept this for the sake of having a state and for the sake of there being a resolution to the problem and being able to move forward. Now, one of the reasons why I say it's a little hard and why this was very political is, it didn't come out so well on the screen. This is the population in Arabs in different areas. So you can see, where are we here? Hello. You can see that in some areas, there was a much higher Jewish population. In other areas, there was a much higher Arab population. The dark is the Arab, the light is the Jewish population. And that was roughly how they were drawing their map. They were sort of trying to loop in the Jewish areas and loop in the Arab areas into bundles. But the problem was that by doing what they were trying to do and the way they were doing this gerrymandering districting, is the Arab state would have about 725,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews in it, meaning there would be 99% Arab and 1% Jewish population. The Jewish state would have 407,000 Arabs and 498,000 Jews, which would be a 45-55 population. And actually, many scholars say that that number is low because the surveys at the time did not properly count for the Bedouins, which means that there's a very good likelihood that this population would have been equal, if not an Arab majority, which would have meant that you would have one Arab state and two Arab states, or one Arab state and half an Arab state. So that was the, okay? so that was the partition plan, and then you had the international city, which was more evenly divided. That was the plan at the time, and we were willing, again, not happily, but we were willing to go along with that as a resolution to. We'll be done at 7, as a resolution to the situation. But you can see why we didn't exactly think it was fair. All right, so this is the Declaration of Independence for Israel, and I'm not going to read it because we're running out of time, but do go home and look up the Declaration of Independence for Israel. It is a beautiful document, and it really lays out very clearly what the goals of the land are and why we have this and what its connection is to everything. So please go and read it.
Now the class is getting more interesting, but it's time.
Yeah, I know. Okay. One of the things, though, well, there's 2 things I want to talk about before we wrap it up for tonight. One is the status quo agreement, and then the other is the War of Independence. So the status quo agreement, this was an agreement that was reached between the secular Jews and the Orthodox Jews of Israel. Now, Theodor Herzl, when he was beginning, he said, faith unites us and knowledge gives us freedom. We shall therefore prevent any theocratic tendencies from coming to the fore on the part of our priesthood. Meaning, Israel is not going to be run by the religion. The religion is why we're together, but we are going to run the country as a democracy. We are not going to appoint religious leaders and take away democracy, which is what a theocracy is. Right? So the rabbis are not going to be the new kings. We will inform, we will teach, and everyone should be united by Judaism, but it's not going to be the political structure of the country. We shall keep our priests within the confines of their temples in the same way that we shall keep the volunteer forces within the confines of their barracks. Right? The same way that we don't put generals in charge of the whole country, even though we respect them and need them, we're also not going to put the rabbis in charge of the country. Right? So that was the basic idea that he had. However, the first prime minister, in order, before the UN voted, to get the Orthodox on board, he had to make an agreement with them on 4 main points. So one of them was Shabbat. And he wrote in a letter, these are Ben Gurion's words, it is clear that the legal day of rest in the Jewish state will be Shabbat, while the members of other religions to rest on their weekly holiday. So this was a major point. Right? The secular Jews did not necessarily think that Shabbat should have any special status. And the Orthodox Jews said, we will not support a government if Shabbat is not officially the day of rest for the whole country. And so that became the status quo. The government agreed to this in order to bring them into the group supporting making Israel a country. Now, it's important to realize that this statement has been interpreted in different ways. Officially, Shabbat is the weekend. You get Shabbat off from your job. But the question becomes, how much will the government control what private citizens do on Shabbat? And that has continued to be a source of conflict. So maybe buses stop, but do taxis have to stop? Right, for private companies? And that's continued to be a source of conflict in the country. Kashrut. Ben Gurion said, all necessary measures should be taken to ensure that every government kitchen which is serving Jews should have kosher food. So the question then becomes, does should have mean only have? I mean, it will be available for people that need kosher food. This also became an issue when it comes to bringing meat into the country. are people who are not part of the government, are they allowed to import non-kosher meat? And for many years, that was not an issue. And then later, the government decided they were going to make it an issue. And now you, for example, cannot import non-kosher meat into the state of Israel. Because even though we call it the status quo, it keeps changing. But these main topics keep coming up. Personal status, perhaps the most controversial. All members of the administration appreciate the seriousness of the problem and the major difficulties. Everything possible will be done to provide the deep needs of the religious to avoid, God forbid, dividing the house of Israel into two. So what does personal status mean? It means, who can you marry? Who counts as a Jew? Where can you be buried? Right? What happens when you need to get a divorce? What Ben Gurion was saying is that we will continue with doing it the way the British did it and doing it the way that the Ottomans did it. The rabbis will be in charge of these topics. Right? So if you want to get married in Israel, you have to get married by a rabbi. You cannot go to the courthouse and have a civil ceremony. And that was agreed upon in order to, as he's saying, not divide the house of Israel in two. Because if you had one group that was following an Orthodox version, and you had another group that was not following the Orthodox version, then the Orthodox version would never be able to marry the non-Orthodox version. They would never trust the marriages that the other people had. They would say that there was adultery and all the other problems, and they would never allow the groups to be together again. It would be literally ripping the people in two. That was the original intent of why Ben Gurion made the compromise, but the compromise, he gave them authority over a big part of human life, which has continued to be, let's call it a big issue up until the modern time. And then education, similarly, is something that looks simple, but has always been a problem. Of each educational system will be guaranteed, and the government will not violate the religious status and religious conscience of any group of Jews. You can teach your kids the way you want to teach your kids. The state, of course, will determine minimal obligatory courses and will supervise compliance with this minimum. And that last sentence is where we still fight. So, okay, fine, you can have a yeshiva, you can, teach your kids whatever you want, Talmud, Mishnah, Midrash, all that stuff. But if the state says they also need to learn civics, they also need to learn geometry, they also need to learn math and basic history, and you don't want to take time to teach those things, now we have a fight. And that fight continues in the modern state. Okay, so let's take care of the war. In 1948, Israel declares independence. The very next day, Israel gets attacked. And they were attacked officially by Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Arab Liberation Army. Those were Arabs within what was called Palestine, and other volunteers from around the Muslim world. It's a long list. Might make you wonder, how did we win? Well, we won for a number of reasons. One, the Arabs were very disunited. And I don't just mean disunited that they didn't coordinate. I mean, they didn't coordinate. They didn't have like one general in charge of everybody giving radio instructions and doing it all perfectly. There was no Eisenhower in charge of the Arab armies, whereas the Jewish army did have one general and underneath.
That's the War of 16.
No, this is 1948, the very first war. But the Arabs also had different goals. So Transjordan, when we talked about before that had been divided, their goal was to take everything. Right? They wanted to take all of the new country and keep it for themselves. They were not trying to establish a Palestinian state. They wanted to make their country bigger and have a Mediterranean coastline, which would have been very nice for them. And the Syrian and the Egyptian armies, their kings and leaders had other goals as well. So they were not all fighting the same war. All of them agreed they didn't want the Jews to live there. But their objective was very different, and they didn't want to let the other side win. So they were fighting us and fighting each other politically. It didn't help. They also underestimated us. Right? We were technically a smaller group at the start of the war, and they thought they would easily be able to just walk over us. I mean, after all, 6 million of us had just been killed in the Holocaust. How hard can they kill 450,000 of us? That should be easy. we turned out to be better trained. We turned out to have people who had actually fought in more wars and therefore had real experience. We also had a good job of getting better weapons and supplies. So we were in better shape as a military than they were. And we were also much better than they thought we were. We also were fighting for survival. They said very clearly, we will kill them all. We will drive them into the sea. We will eradicate them. That kind of language makes you not want to surrender. Whereas the Arabs were not fighting for survival, they were fighting to destroy us. And that means, how much do they want to risk just to kill us? Because they're going to have to risk themselves if they want to fight us. And that can make a person a little bit more hesitant. We were fighting from a central location, whereas they were coming from around. So that meant that when we were in Israel, if we needed to send troops, we were sending them from that center of Israel. Whereas their troops up here couldn't come all the way around and help the other troops on the bottom. So even though we were often outnumbered in the total armies, we could direct a larger group to where we needed it, sometimes much better than they could. And actually, at the end, Israel probably had a larger army at the end of the war. It's hard to get the real numbers of both sides, but Israel mobilized everybody. Everybody picked up a gun. If you were, old enough and you were strong enough, you were going out to fight. Whereas the Arab armies were, on the whole, quite small. 20,000 people, 10,000 people, 5,000 people. These were not all of Egypt coming to attack. These were smaller armies than they could have done. And that was good for us, because it meant that by the end of the war, our army was actually far superior to what was attacking us. And I already mentioned about the better training. Okay. So as the war came to an end, the troops were standing. You had the Israeli troops along that line and along this line here, and you had the Jordanian troops right there, and the Syrian troops and the Lebanese troops. And that was where the armistice happened. That's where we said, okay, we're going to stop shooting for a while. Technically, except for Egypt and Jordan, we've never made peace. The other countries are still officially at war with us. And that's going to flare up a few more times when we talk about that next week. But it looks a little different than the first map. And that's because of the fighting. By the time the fighting settled, this is where the soldiers had lined up. This is where they had been able to take positions to defend their homes and their country. And when it was done, Israel said, all right, this is all Israel then. And Jordan said, okay, this is Jordan. And Egypt said, that's Egypt. And no one ever decided to make an Arab state. Right? The Arab state that could have been made here and here was taken not by Israel, but by Jordan and Egypt. Because after they realized we were not going to be destroyed, they could have turned to the Arabs who lived here and said, oh, sorry guys, we lost, but go ahead, have your own country. But neither Jordan nor Egypt nor the other countries around them made that decision. Instead, they said, all right, just wait, we'll get them next time. And it's 2017. Next time has never come, thank God. But it is why there is no Palestinian state. The best explanation of where did it all go wrong at the very beginning was in 1948. Before the partition, they could have accepted it. And even after the war, they could have accepted it. And they did. Okay, so we'll go on from 48 to the modern world next week. I just want to turn off the recording. I'll take some extra questions.